Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another gigantic video. This is a continuation of our Hero Series set of guides, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Mages and Casters. The Mages and Casters' primary focus in Gigantic is to do damage and to control the game. The Shooters, which I've already done in my previous video, definitely have more of a focus on just pure damage. Some of these Mages, however, can control the game a little bit more through AoEs they put on the ground, through the debuffs they apply, and they're just generally a little bit more utility based perhaps than the Shooters, which are more raw damage focused. This gameplay belongs to HSM Gameplay on YouTube, so please go check out the original video and show him some love as well. Without further ado, let's get into it, starting with Charnock. Charnock is the Fire Mage of Gigantic. He does huge damage from range, he sets people on fire, he's got big splash damage, big AoE, and is generally just that character that applies a whole bunch of pressure and team AoE damage from the backline. A lot of his abilities have a delay or are skill shots with travel time, so whereas Shooters, for example, are sort of hit scan, you put your crosshair over the target and click and it does damage. Charnock has to lead his targets with his left click, with his LMB, which is a charged fireball. It does a lot more damage in one hit, and if you get good with it, you can start to throw down some serious hurt. For the rest of his kit, his right click is Dragon's Breath, which does a cone attack in front of you. His Q is Detonate, which is his escape move, which propels himself forward, backwards, or up, depending on which direction you're moving, and this pushes away nearby enemies and does damage to them as well. Hot Hail is his E, and that targets an area and then bombards it with flaming rocks for 4 seconds. And then his ultimate is Flame On, makes flames erupt in front of you, pushing enemies away and creates burning areas as well. So through all of this, Charnock can just create mass amounts of damage across the map, leaving things on the floor, making rocks fall from the sky, lots of splash damage, lots of burning, just generally mass AoE team damage. And that's really where his strength lies, just being able to apply that constant pressure pretty indiscriminately across the enemy team. You know, if you're in a skirmishing or sort of like a poking phase of a fight around a point, Charnock is just going to be, you know, bringing that total pool of the enemy's team, just bringing that health down, making it so when you go in for the actual engagement, you know, you're just starting off on that stronger foot. His poke and his control and his area damage is exceptional. His weakness, unsurprisingly, as for most mages, definitely comes from his mobility. He only has Detonate, which he can throw himself around with on a 12-second cooldown. It's not a good escape. He's also quite a big, fat, chunky target as well, so he's a little bit easier to hit than some of the other mages. So he definitely can be weak if he's, you know, left alone with an assassin or even with another shooter. His upgrades basically allow him to set everything on fire more often, increase the duration of burn, deal extra damage to a burning target, etc, etc. You can upgrade his right click, his Dragon's Breath, to give you some more defensive stuff as well. So if you're getting attacked a bunch by assassins or you really feel like you're struggling to survive, you can take a path that gives you deflection and 20% front damage reduction when using your right click, and then you can upgrade that to give you 40% damage reduction as well, really make you very, very tanky if you find yourself being focused a bunch by melee. You can move more into a control styled build as well, so you can upgrade his Hot Hail, which makes rocks fall from the sky. You can increase the area size and make that slow as well, so you know, if you're on maps with more choke points, you can really just fill those choke points with that AoE that nobody wants to run into. So he's got lots of interesting ways that he can build, focusing on purely damage, making himself a bit more defensive, or really making himself more of a AoE splash damage CC god. In general, he's a great fun character to play. However, that lack of mobility and the fact that it can be quite hard to output a lot of damage on one person when you need it. You can definitely do a whole bunch of damage across the team, but his single target damage can be a bit lacking compared to some others. Combine that with a lack of escape means that you do need a lot of team support to help keep you alive. Having said that, properly supported, you can do loads of damage across an enemy team and really just win out fights through pressure. The next hero we're going to talk about is Mozu. Now, while Charnock previously definitely filled that standard kind of archetype of a fire mage that you might expect, not much mobility but lots of damage, lots of setting stuff on fire, Mozu's role is a little bit harder to pin down. Mozu acts more like a shooter in that a bunch of her damage is really based around her left click, and the rest of her kit makes her kind of slippery and actually provides quite a lot of utility to the team as well. So I think that out of all the heroes that I've covered so far, Mozu is the closest to what I would call a hybrid. She's perhaps somewhere between a damage and a support. I definitely wouldn't call her a support. She's definitely a mage still, and her primary role is definitely damage, but she has a bunch of utility and elements that can really help support the rest of her team in fights, and what she gives up for that is perhaps that initial damage that you would get out of a Charnock. You're not going to find quite as much of that here, despite the fact that Mozu can still be very, very dangerous. Just the rest of her kit is just a little bit more utility focused than perhaps you might be expecting on a mage. So her kit, her left click is magic bolts, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment because these are quite an interesting mechanic on this left click. Her right click is the attract beam, which slows down enemies when you fire it and hold it. Her Q is a vortex, which you can put on the floor, which will deflect enemy projectiles that go into it, so some nice ranged cover. And then her E is Dimension Door, where she teleports to a target location. Her ultimate is Death Ray, which is a huge death beam that slows enemies hit and does a whole bunch of damage. So from her teleport and her arcane vortex in her kit, you can see that she's again got that support and has that mobility. Again, compared to Charnock, much more mobile and has a more defensive nature. Having said that, her left click is something you hold down and it continually fires magic bolts, but the longer you hold it down, the more the attack speed increases. So for the first sort of portion of the attacks, it's quite slow, doesn't deal a whole bunch of damage, but as you get to the end of the charge, she starts to attack faster and faster and starts to really shred people. This promotes kind of an interesting gameplay style where you're trying to weave in and out of the fight and only be up there dealing a lot of damage when your magic bolts are in their sort of second phase of higher DPS. You can sort of start firing before you've even sort of entered combat, so by the time you hit, you're always in that second phase, but it's an interesting style of play and quite unique to this character. In terms of the way that Mozu can be upgraded, you can turn her left click into dealing even more damage and charging up longer. You can also turn it into something that gives you 40% damage reduction if you use it after an arcane vortex. So there's some interesting things you can do to make her a bit tankier. Her attractor beam, her right click, you can make that fire your left click as well, and you can also make it interrupt enemies, deal 3 times damage against foes below 33% health, which is really good for finishing people off. Her arcane vortex, you can change it from a deflect projectile spell to a reflect, which actually just fires the projectiles back at their original target rather than just being deflected anywhere. You can also upgrade this to give your allies a speed boost when passing through it as well, so some nice interesting utility that you can help people with. You can even upgrade it so the vortex pulls people in, which it pulls an enemy in, which is interesting. Moving on from Mozu, we're now taking a look at Oru. These characters are strangely similar in that they both have quite specific individual mechanics that are only relevant to them. And so Oru's entire playstyle is based around his cards. You can't really talk about Oru without explaining his kit first, so we'll do that. So his left click is called Judgment, which throws a Judgment card at the enemy. If that hits, they get the debuff called Judgment and are also burning for 3 seconds. His right click is called the Beast, which tosses a spread of 3 beast cards in a cone in front of him. If that card hits an enemy, they're inflicted with the Beast debuff and will also be slowed. His Q is called the Joker, which places 3 cards in a row at his feet, 3 traps essentially. If someone runs over the traps, the enemy takes damage and they're also pushed back, which is really good for defending yourself. And then the rest of his kit is based around his E, which is called Cosmic Power. So that damages the target area and reveals cards held by enemies. So again, if those enemies have been hit by debuffs by your previous cards. If they have a Judgment card on them, they hit for 250 damage. If they have the Beast card, they are dazed, which means they can't use any skills for 1 second. And if they have both, then they're affected by both. His ultimate is called Death Dealer. So this rapidly tosses death cards out in front of you. And then once that's completed, he reveals all the cards and it deals a bunch of damage. More damage as well based on if the enemy is below 50% health. So it's got an execute mechanic to it as well. So Mozu has an interesting playstyle where he's really trying to get both Judgment and the Beast debuffs up on as many of the enemy team as possible, and then activating them all at the same time using Cosmic Power. He has no mobility and no escapes at all, and no real utility apart from the fact that he inflicts slows with the Beast and he sets up burning. He's really a pure damage character. He also has to be quite close in, sort of differing quite a lot from Charnock, who can do a lot of damage from range. Mozu has to be in close, and he has to be in close hitting those cards and applying those debuffs for him to then use his Cosmic Power and to blow them up on the enemy. His only real defensive is the Joker, which puts traps at your feet, which can be quite good as a disruption, but the fact that he has to be quite close in, he doesn't have any lifesteal or anything like that, and he doesn't have any escapes, make him quite a juicy target for melee, so he does need support and help. So Oru has access to a lot of debuffs. Inherently he can put up burning and he can slow the enemy. He can upgrade his Cosmic Power to put crack armor on the enemy. He can do bleeding, he can do stuns, he can do cripples, he can even put up curses. So he really is a bit of a master debuffer. He's a lot of fun to play, but it does require that you're trying to really keep tabs on who you've hit with your abilities, and then using that Cosmic Power to explode them all at once and hit that nasty AoE damage that he's known for. The one issue is that when you dodge in Gigantic, you do get an iframe, and if people dodge when you're hitting your Cosmic Power, it won't do any damage, and his animation is quite obvious, so that's something to watch out for. But he's a super interesting hero, quite unique as well, unique gameplay mechanics. Again, I think that in general, he's going to be quite difficult to play because his lack of escapes, and he's quite a big boy, and he's not too fast, so he might get chewed down by melee quite a lot, but still, very, very cool, interesting hero. Next up, we're taking a look at Zenobia. Now, Zenobia, again, quite unique from the other casters, as she is a hero that revolves a lot around lifesteal. She puts up a bunch of curses, she does a lot of control, a whole bunch of debuffs. She does have to be quite close to the enemy, but she's definitely more of a control-focused hero than a damage one. She's in there, she's deceptively tanky because she drains life with her Q, and which makes her, in a 1v1 scenario, quite difficult to deal with. She doesn't have a lot of burst damage, but she will put up a whole bunch of debuffs on you and just drain you down while sustaining herself. So she's definitely focused on that type of gameplay, rather than the sort of bursty type that you might see from Oru or Charnock. So looking at her kit, Gaze of Envy is her left click, which is a life drain, 25 health per second onto yourself. Her right click is Words of Spite, which is a homing projectile, which when it hits cracks armor. Her Q is Wave of Sorrow, which is a ground-based projectile and knocks up and weakens enemies for 4 seconds. And then her E is Mark of Despair, which is an area targeted attack and slows movement for enemies in that area. Her ultimate is Cursed Soil, which targets an area and disables all enemies in that area and drains 50 health per second from them. So enemies can't take damage apart from her, should I say, while this is happening. This is a difficult ultimate to use effectively, because when you land it, you make enemies invincible, but they're taking damage from you. So it's kind of good for control, for locking up a team. For example, if you guys are about to get the jump on, let's say, a couple of the enemy that are out of position, landing this and then allowing the rest of your team to arrive in those next couple of seconds, or position, or set up on the enemy, very, very strong. What you don't want to do is use it randomly in the middle of a team fight while you're winning, because your friendly guys might be throwing damage on them, they might be in the perfect spot, and then you ult and make the enemy immune to all damage apart from yours for 4 seconds. So it's an interesting one to use. Reminds me a lot of sort of certain League of Legends ultimates that do similar things that can end up damaging your team more than the enemy. Having said that, if it's used effectively and properly and at the right time, it can be super strong. A lot of Zenobia's upgrades are all about more curses, more debuffs. You can have more life drain on your left click, or you can make it apply weakness and then eventually give AoE rather attack damage to your allies. Your right click, Words of Spite, a homing projectile that cracks armor. You can have that bounce to additional targets. You can make it cause bleeding. It can slow enemies and give you a speed boost. You know, again, it's all about control, all about trying to turn the odds in your favor in every single fight. Wave of Sorrow again can, which knocks enemies up in the air. It can also heal you. You can make it crack armor. You can make it launch enemies as well as just knock up. Again, there's a lot of control and just a lot of utility that this character has access to. She will be difficult to play. She operates at quite a short range against a team where, if you find that fights are being very long and drawn out, she's great for that, because for the most part, the longer a fight goes on, the more her life drain, the more those debuffs she puts up are going to start to have an effect. So if it's a game where the fights are really dragging out and people are trying to run away and sort of sustain, she can really apply a lot of pressure for her team and maybe just win just through sheer output. Again, another interesting mage to play around with for sure. Next up, we're taking a look at Ezren Gal. So Ezren is a necromancer. He is a caster, so he's definitely focused more on damage than perhaps utility or area denial. He's also relatively tanky for a caster. I wouldn't call him tanky in the grand scheme of things, but among the casters, he's one of the more survivable of the bunch. So we'll jump straight into his kit. So, like Zenobia, his left click gives him souls and also heals 50 health on hit. So he's got that built-in sustain, however that doesn't do a whole lot of damage. His left click feeds him with souls, which he uses for Soulfire, his right click, which is a medium range projectile that deals 200 damage at 15 meters. Doesn't have a cooldown, and you can store up to 3 souls from your left click. So you can spam 200 damage 3 times in a row, which is quite a lot of burst. His Q is Spectral Form, which gives him 35% damage reduction, allows him to pass through enemies. Also deals damage to enemies around you as well. So that's his defensive, the defensive side of his kit showing up there. And his E is Well of Souls, which is an area targeted attack, and then after a moment it deals a bunch of damage and then immobilizes enemies for half a second. His ultimate is Soul Blast, which steals health and souls from nearby enemies, and after 2 seconds performs a massive blast which deals a whole bunch of damage. Soul Blast is interesting. It's a very strong ability, but it is quite obvious when it's going off, and that 2-second delay means that it can be interrupted quite easily. So if you are going to play Ezren Gal, do be aware that you can't just mash your ultimate at any time. You need to be aware, because it's quite easy to break you out of it. So Ezren's definitely more of a close range mage as well, sort of similar to Zenobia and Mozu a little bit. He's again doesn't have the range of Charnok or anything like that. Again, he's tankier than you might expect. His Spectral Form, which has a 15-second cooldown and has a 4-second duration, allows him to be pretty tanky, which is nice. Combine that with his Q, which gives him health back on hit, and he's one of the tankier casters for sure. Again, he won't stand up like a tank. Don't get it twisted. He will fall over if he gets targeted, but quite like Zenobia, he has some of that nice sustain in a fight, which is good. He does have more damage than Zenobia, and also much more like on-command damage. If you can spam those soul fires into someone, you can do a lot of damage very quickly. He does probably have some of the more consistent burst on a single target than the rest of the mages, but you need the souls to prepare it, and you need to be quite close to land it. But still, it's it can be quite scary when it comes out and you're not expecting it. In terms of his kit, he basically makes the choice between making himself tankier and doing more damage. And again, that will be up to you depending on what kind of game you're having and what the enemy team is doing. So you can make it so that your left click gives you more health with each soul. You can also make it so it hits multiple people and deals more damage. His Soulfire, his right click, the main source of his damage, you can make it so with each consistent hit you can increase its damage by 20%. It's one of the upgrades. You can make the projectile pierce through enemies as well, which is great. You can upgrade his Spectral Form to heal you as well when you hit enemies, which is really nice. So not only do you have that left click healing, your Spectral Form will heal you when you're taking vastly less damage. Makes you that little bit more survivable as well. His Well of Souls also provides him with some nice area denial as well for those maps with choke points and things like that. So again, quite a well-rounded kit, quite nice and defensive, some ground targeted effects to sort of block off certain areas, and a lot of upfront damage as well. Make him pretty interesting. Again, the main drawback is that he does need to be quite close, and aside from his Spectral Form, he doesn't have any teleports. His mobility isn't great. And while he is tanky, he's definitely not going to stand toe-to-toe with a tank. So, interesting character again. Looks like a lot of fun to play. But again, I think you've got to be pretty good to sort of ride that line between being too aggressive and then not aggressive enough. The final hero we're going to be taking a look at is none other than everybody's favourite granny. It's Griselma. So Griselma is the closest thing Gigantic has to a pet class. So her right clicks summon portal beasts, which are essentially stationary turrets that will shoot anything nearby and have a relatively limited range. They can be attacked and they can die. That's sort of where a lot of her damage comes from, is these turrets that she puts down, turrets slash pets. Her left click, called Reach Out, does very, very little damage, but it means that your turrets prioritize whatever you're currently holding that attack on. Her Q is Rift Zone, which is an area she puts down on the floor that deals damage and cracked armor, and also if she puts Portal Beasts in the Rift Zone when it's down, their cooldown is reduced from 9 to 6 seconds, which is pretty great. And then her E is Displacement, which basically allows her to vanish into a portal and regenerate a bunch of health, and then pop out of it again. The ultimate is the Abyss, which creates a Mega Beast, which deals a bunch of damage and it launches on spawn and it lives for 8 seconds. Pretty cool, pretty interesting. The main issue with Griselma is, though, I actually really like her kit, and I think it's a really fun design for a character. Like most, I guess, turret-based characters, if you kill her turrets, she's kind of useless. If your team is aware that when a portal beast pops up, you need to kill it, then she's in trouble, because she doesn't do any consistent damage without them being alive. Having said that, if you are on a team that isn't dealing with them and they're up, she can be very, very difficult to push and to press. If she sets up her portal beast correctly, she can just back off to wherever they are, hold left click on a melee, and then all her portal beasts will start hitting that melee that's trying to push. You know, it's almost like Teemo in League of Legends. Like you don't ever want to follow him into the bushes, you know, because there's going to be mushrooms everywhere. So it's kind of the same with Griselma. You don't want to, if she's backing you off and luring you away from a fight, you're going to get a lot of hands jumping out of nowhere, zapping you, and then when she gets low on health, she's going to hit Displacement, vanish into a portal, and you're just left with 3 portal beasts trying to kill you. It does mean that her ability to fight is really pinned to wherever her portal beasts are, and because they're quite easy to kill, it's a real balance between how far forward you position your portal beasts. Has the fight moved away from them? Because if so, you're not going to be effective anymore. So yeah, it's a real coin flip about whether you can do well with her or not. Revolves around your team being aware of where you've set up, the enemy team if they're killing them. Yeah, again, awesome concept for a character, but difficult to judge how viable it is. It's going to be a game-to-game kind of thing. In terms of her upgrades, it's all about just boosting her portal beasts. You can give them armor, you can make them inflict shock by holding down your left click on the enemy. On the portal beast ability itself, you can have it so when they're idle, they are invisible and rapidly gain health. You can make it so they do armor breaking attacks, which is very, very strong. You can make them buff your allies if they're nearby them with 10% damage and 10 armor. That's pretty nuts. You can then buff that later on to make that 15% damage and 15% armor, which is kind of crazy. You can also have it so your portal beast eat all debuffs and heal nearby allies, so you can turn yourself into almost like a support character. Interesting design. Again, you can sort of build in that more supporty way depending on how the team fights are going if you want to. I mean, again, it's very interesting. Rift Zone you can upgrade so that it shields your portal beasts, which is pretty crazy. So if you put that Rift Zone down and then you spawn a portal beast, it will gain a shield for 500 health, which is awesome. And yeah, again, lots of ways to sort of interact with it. Again, a super fun, interesting character, but maybe a little hard to judge how viable she is. So that concludes our look at mages and casters in Gigantic. There are plenty of other heroes we haven't talked about yet. We've got supports and we have tanks, so still wait for those videos, guys. Those are coming. The casters in this game are all very unique and quite interesting. Again, there's no two that are really similar in how they play. You know, it's not just standard fire mage or Frost Mage or Lightning Dude. Like, there's some individual game mechanics that live within each hero, which isn't always as obvious in some other games, right? They're all really, really fun to play, and yeah, I'll be streaming this game on twitch.tv/Zane25, so please come hang out. Thank you so much guys for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.